Hello animators and welcome back to Game Animation. Now that we've got the setup all out of the way, it's time to actually start working on our character. I know this is what you actually came here for, is to start building this character. So the very first and one of the most important pieces that we can build for a character is the idle or default pose. Now this is the pose that you see when your character's standing around in the game doing nothing. Now, at first, it might not seem like that's a very important thing because most games you don't really stand around and do nothing for a large part of the game. And that's true. This is a pose that you don't really see that often in a lot of games when you're just playing them naturally. But the thing about default poses is they're really important for, one, kind of getting a feel for the character as an animator, and two, they're a pose that many elements of the game kind of come back to over and over and over again. So it's a pose that we as animators really care about a lot. You know, when your character starts to run and then they stop, this is the pose it goes into. When you do an attack and let that sort of time out, this is the pose you go into. It's the pose that almost everything in our game is going to start from and end at. So before we get in there and start making our own idle pose, I wanted to take a moment at the beginning here to kind of look at some idle poses from other games and talk about how the feeling, the shape, the tone, what you choose for your idle pose, how it can affect the overall feel of the character, and also might dictate in a lot of ways what players kind of envision is the character they're playing in the game. So let's hop on over to the workstation and I'm going to run through some screenshots, some images from games, and talk a little bit about the choices they made in the idle pose and how they influence the feel of the character overall. All right, so I grabbed some screenshots from some games I'm playing now and also a couple of my favorite games from over the past few years. And I'm just going to run through and talk about some of the takeaways that we can grab from their idle poses, okay? So this is a screenshot from Inside. This is one of my favorite games of all time. If you haven't played this, go play it. But one of the things I love about this game is that, unlike a lot of other games, you're not really a very heroic character, and I actually really like that the idle pose kind of messages that to you as a player. You know, if you look at this pose, the character is, you know, they're sort of hunched forward, the head's out in front, they're sort of crouched and ready. Their hands aren't out in this ready pose like they're an action hero or anything like that. They're kind of closed and contained and huddled. And that really tells you almost everything you need to know about this character. And as you play through the game, you find out that you're being pursued. The world is a bad place. And so just by the first moment, this is right at the very beginning of the game, you can tell that this character is not a hero. It's just a kid, and they're in a world that they don't really understand and are nervous about. And they tell you that right off the bat with the idle pose. Now, if we contrast that with our next one here, let me clear this up. Now, this one you're probably familiar with. This is God of War. This is a totally different scene, right? One, it's a different camera, so it's much more dynamic. We know that this game, just from the camera, just from the get-go, is going to be an action game where we're going to do action things. But also, the character tells you that too in their idle pose. He's got a really wide stance that shows he's sort of ready to fight. His arms are out. He's got weapons in the hands. Not only that, it's sort of at a 3/4 view, which gives us a much more dynamic feel of the character, like they're ready to charge into action. There's also a couple other subtle things here that the animators did that I really love, which is that he's slightly leaned forward this way. And you can see that the head is also looking that way. So what you get is this feeling of a really grounded, tough character that's leaning into the fight. And if you've played God of War, you know that that is exactly what the game is about. It's about a tough guy who literally leans into every fight. Another game that I've been playing recently that has a similar vibe is Godfall. Now in Godfall, you can see there's actually a similar camera. We're kind of behind the character, over their shoulder. But even more so than God of War, the character is 3/4 shoulder towards us, really sort of like leaning forward. And one of the things that I like about this pose in this game is that this weapon is, or this game is so much about the weapons you're carrying. You sort of pick up these really insane weapons that are huge on your character. And if the character was facing any more towards the camera, kind of like how it was in the God of War pose, these weapons would get kind of lost in the silhouette. But because they turn this character even more, almost not even 3/4, it's almost completely with one shoulder forward, what you get is these weapons really nice out in silhouette behind the character. So choosing the pose to your character is also a lot about telling the player what they should care about, right? So in this game, I know I'm caring about the cool armor that they're featuring to me right here in the foreground and the really cool weapons that are on my back, okay? So let's go take a look at just a couple more here. So this one is Immortal Phoenix Rising. This is a game I've been playing recently. And, you know, this one, the character's a little bit further away. It's a little bit more of an arcadey, action-y game. If you've played like the Assassin's Creed game or anything like that, it's a little bit like that. And you know, while this character feels a little bit more generic, they still have some cool heroic-y feeling elements. You know, you can tell that this character is intended to be a hero. The shoulders are back, the hands are down in these nice fists. Once again, you've got this really wide stance, which sort of like tells me this character's stable and ready to go. And there's some nice little elements about the character that just sort of draw your attention, you know, this nice light in the edges of the weapon. So they not only through the pose, but also through some nice art and color, tell you what to really focus on. Now, this last one I'm going to show is probably a popular contender for a lot of people's favorite game over the last couple years, and that is Breath of the Wild. Now, one thing that's interesting about Breath of the Wild and a lot of games like this is you look at this pose and there's really not much there. He's really just kind of standing there. And you could probably argue, well, they could have made Link more heroic, or they could have done, turned him 3/4 to make him feel a little bit more actiony. But one of the interesting things about Breath of the Wild is that mechanically, one of the things you do over the course of the game is use tons of different weapons and you stack things up on your character. So if the animators had really pushed the, dynamic pose here, what would have happened is they would have run into some challenges down the road when switching weapons and whatnot, that they would have had to redo that pose every single time because it would be so dynamic. They'd have to worry about clipping and whatnot. And because they chose this sort of neutral pose, what it allows is you to, and I'll show you here, this next frame here, it allows them to stack up all sorts of weapons on this character. It allows them to just change the arm positions to hold different weapons, and really allows Link to be this everyman, this kind of blank slate character that is what you play in the game. So it's almost interesting to me that I think they knew that Link is a kind of blank character that is going to be this palette for you to pile a bunch of stuff on and try out a bunch of different weapons. And because of that, they chose a very vanilla and neutral pose. So that's it. That's all the screenshots I'm going to kind of look at and draw over here. Next, we're going to take a look at our character and decide what might be some good choices for us to try out for our idle pose. So that was just a little bit of taste of some of the games that are out there. I could go all day doing analysis of the idle poses, run poses, cameras, whatever, of a slew of different games. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of where we're going to go in this episode as we start to explore and figure out what might be a good idle or default pose for our character. Now, anytime I start a new animation project, a new character, a new anything in games, honestly, the first thing I like to do before diving in and actually getting right down to the animation is to just sit down and think about it for a while. I don't use a lot of video reference for my animations. Sometimes I'll collect images and whatnot, but really most of my planning for a lot of my animations is really just sitting down and thinking about it a lot beforehand. You'll find this repeated in many of my videos, that I like to just take a moment, set aside some time, and just think about it. So what do we want to do here? We're going to come up with an idle or default pose for this character. I already showed you in the setup that we're going to use this Thor guy that we've got. And I'm just going to sit down and try to generate some key words that I think are important aspects of this character that we can maybe use to go search image searches to try to find some images that we can use for reference, or that might influence the pose that we end up using for this character. So I already wrote down a couple here. As you can see, you know, Thor comes with some baggage already from what we've seen of him in the Marvel universe. He's a very confident, heroic, tough guy, right? So that's a kind of baseline what we know about this character. If I was to have been given this character by someone else, this is probably the brief they would have given me. But I kind of want to take a little bit of a different spin. I don't want to just do the same Thor that we've seen 100 times. So I was thinking about maybe taking this in a little bit of a different direction, more like old school, actual Norse god Thor. Is he a Norse god? He's some god. And maybe going more of the barbarian route. So that's something I'm going to write down here is barbarian. I'll just write barb for now. Now, that kind of comes with a little bit of a different vibe, right? You know, it comes with like a tough, but maybe not so smart, a little bit more angry maybe is a thing I would consider with barbarian. So I'm going to write that down, angry. And another thing that I sort of connect with barbarians is big, chunky, heavy weapons. So I know that Thor traditionally has a hammer, but we could maybe even explore using a different weapon for this version of Thor that would give us more of that barbarian vibe. So I'm going to write down big, heavy weapon. And while we're at it, we can maybe start crossing off some things as well. So if we go this barbarian direction, maybe some of these no longer quite work. Like heroic, I don't know if I really think of barbarians as being particularly heroic. They are heroic in battle in their own way, but they're not this sort of like confident heroic that we think of when we think of like the Marvel Thor. So for now, I'm actually going to cross these off. We'll cross off heroic and confident. And I think tough, though, tough is one that we still, I think, really fits with this barbarian angle. So here's what I've got right now. I've got barbarian, angry, big heavy weapons, and tough. And I think that is kind of an interesting list to start with for a character, because I think it's enough to really start thinking about what a pose for this character could look like, and also get us kind of searching for some reference images. So I'm actually going to hop over to the computer now, do a little image searching, and try to grab some reference that might help us pose this character out. All right, so I took a trip over to the good old Google and did an image search for barbarians and came up with all sorts of crazy stuff. Of course, I got a lot of pulpy images from the Frank Frazetta era and whatnot. And I tried to grab just a few that I thought had some interesting elements that were relevant to what we wanted to do here. So here, this image was pretty close to what I, just think about when I think about barbarian. There's not a ton that I can take from this one exactly, other than, this sort of arms out. I feel like that's a pretty common thing in a lot of these, is that barbarians in art are never portrayed as like closed up. They're always making themselves look bigger and wider than they actually are. So let's take a look at some of these other ones. This one I thought was very interesting, because another element that I noticed in a lot of these was this sort of hunched, let me change this to blue, this sort of hunched forward look to their upper body. Many of them are very tough, but oftentimes when you think of a tough guy, you think of shoulders back, standing upright. But a lot of these barbarians, they're not worried about their posture, so they're a little bit more forward. So you notice that it still has the shoulders back, right? The shoulders are still pushed back, but the chest is sort of hunched forward because it doesn't care about his posture, and the head's a little bit more jutted out in a forward angle, right? And still we have this I'm really wide, tough guy look, right? So that's probably something that we want to think about getting into our pose, is that if we wanted to feel like a barbarian, the pose is going to be wide. let's take a look at some of the other ones we've got here. Let's trash that. Go next. Okay, so here again, we have a similar thing. This has the same kind of things. You can see that the character's sort of leaning forward. The chest is a little bit hunched. So we're starting to see some common themes here in what we think about as barbarians. Once again, we got this huge wide stance. And in fact, maybe my only critique of this would be that if we wanted to be consistent with our other ones, that maybe this even wider grip would make this feel a little bit more barbarian-y, because he'd be sort of showing off and making himself as wide as he possibly can. But once again, we've got the head forward. So the things that I'm starting to see as consistent across many of these images is this really wide stance, this idea of making yourself bigger even than you actually are, even though they're already big guys. And then this sort of hunched forward, bad posture look that a lot of these barbarians have. Okay, let's hop over to the next one. And here's one that has a little bit more of a confident vibe. Now, I would say that this isn't quite an idle pose so much because of the leg up, but once again, we've got some of the same features, you know, like the arms way out here to the side, not in like a natural position that we'd expect like a normal person to be holding their arms. The legs, instead of being, you know, straight down to the ground, are out in this big, wide, triangular shape. So I think that we're all starting to see some similar things across a lot of these. And here is maybe the most exaggerated version of all of these. We have a literal triangle of a character here, and these arms are way out to the side. He's way hunched forward, way head out in front. Okay, so I think that the things that I'm going to take away from this that kind of make a barbarian character in our brains, and this is sort of just consistent across the archetype, is really wide stance, chest kind of forward a little bit, and head jutted out in front. So physically, that's what we're going to be aiming for. Now, I also was thinking about weapons, and I think, like I said, that while Thor traditionally has a hammer for a weapon, I was thinking of some of these old, more brutal weapons, like a spiked club or something like that. So I think I might aim for a pose that's something like this, but instead of a hammer, I think I might end up making a mace with just some big spikes on it to just add a little bit of brutality to this character, give us something that's a little bit heavier, kind of like a meat grinder or a meat tenderizer that we can just beat him up with. So that's it. That's kind of where I'm going to stop with my reference, and we'll hop over to Maya next and see what we can come up with. Now, with just a few minutes of thinking, I feel like I've really got some good nuggets to work on for this character. I have some ideas about what I might want to do with the pose. I have some keywords that I'm going to try to hit for this character when I start building these pose in Maya. So I think the next step is to open up our character and really just start digging in. Now that we're finally ready to start animating, let's head over to Maya, get this scene, get our character all set up and ready to go, and start working on this pose. Now, I'm going to try to explore a few different variations of this pose, and hopefully by the end of this, we'll have at least one that we think is worthy to get through the process and put into the game. Let's go. All right, we're finally headed over to Maya to start animating, and the first thing we're going to do is set up our scene with our referenced characters. Now, if you haven't done this kind of thing before, if you haven't referenced characters in, basically all we're saying is instead of opening the rig files or the prop file itself, we're actually going to create a reference of those in our scene. Now, the reason for that is that if we ever want to edit either the rig or our prop file, what this will do is it will let us edit that external file, and any changes we make to it will actually propagate automatically to the reference scene. So if I want to change slightly the size or shape of my weapon in the future, for example, if it's referenced into my scenes, changing that will automatically change it in all the scenes that it's referenced in. It's a pretty quick process, pretty quick setup, so let's hop over and do that first before we get to posing. All right, So I opened a fresh scene of Maya here, and the very first thing we're going to do actually is edit the frames per second. Now, for anybody who's worked on film before, you're probably used to using 24 frames per second, but we're actually going to use 30 frames per second, and that's pretty standard across the game industry, using either 30 or 60 frames per second. It's what most game engines expect, so get used to thinking a little bit differently at a little bit different frame rate. Now that's what we're going to do right down here, the frames per second. We're going to grab it, change to 30 frames per second, and that part is done. So next up, we're going to go and grab our reference files. First off, we're going to get the rig, and then we're going to pull in the prop. So let's go to File, Create Reference, and we're going to navigate to our Thor rig, grab it here. And this is going to take a moment to open. It's just like opening the scene normally. It's going to spin for a second, and it's just generating a reference of our rig file here in this new file that we've created. And here we are. Here is the glorious Thor in T-pose. Now I'm going to press 6 to give me my materials, and I have a nice little hotkey for turning on and off my NURBS curves for the controls, so that's something you might want to think about. And if you see me flicking these on and off constantly, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to turn on anti-aliasing here to just get nice smooth stuff. And that's it, I think, for the character referenced in. Next, we want to go grab our prop. So we're going to do the same process again. File, Create Reference. And this time we're going to navigate to our Thor folder and to props. Now, in between videos, I actually stopped for a minute and actually made that prop I talked about, a nice spiked club thing. So if you haven't done that yet or don't have a weapon yet, maybe go find something, find a hammer, find whatever, and get that prop ready to go before moving on. But since I already have this here, I'm going to select it now, hit reference, and bring it in here. And you can see I have this nice spiked club. Now, this club was just from the Infinity Blade weapons that I showed how to grab and export in the setup episode. So you can hunt through those weapons if you don't really want to like make something from scratch yourself and see what there is in there that you could use. Now, the last step we want to do for the setup here is actually get this thing in the hand. And thankfully, we have these handy little prop bones. It's this little diamond here below the wrist of the character right there. Now, if you're accidentally selecting the mesh and stuff, for the moment, we can turn that off using this little button up here. Click that, and it'll make you no longer able to select the mesh, so you can select these curves easily. Now, we're going to create a constraint between this bone and our weapon by selecting that first, turning back on mesh select, and hitting shift. So I'm holding down shift and selecting this. And then we're going to go up here to constrain. Now, if you don't see constrain up here, you might be in a different working format. So you want to make sure you have animation selected. That'll make the constraint menu appear up here. So you want to click constrain, and we're going to point constrain it. We're going to click again and orient constrain it, and then click again and scale constrain it. Okay. Now, why did I do all those different constraints? Well, those are all the different ways that we want this weapon to move with this bone. So the point constraint pulls it to the point. The orient constraint means that as I rotate it, it's going to orient with it. And the scale constraint is constraining the scale so that when I scale this, it will scale with it, right? Those are all the different behaviors that we want out of this. So we can see now if I translate it, move it around, it moves with it. If I rotate, it rotates with it. And likewise, if I scale, it will scale with it. So the reason I do all those constraints is because those are all the things that we want it to do when we attach it in game. When we bring these animations into game, we're going to attach this actual weapon from Unreal to this same joint so that any animation we've done in Maya should look exactly the same in Unreal as it did in our Maya scene because we parented it and animated it just like this. So that's it for the scene setup. We're going to just save this out quick. Let's save this out as Thor Anim scene. I just have this in my Thor Anims folder, and it's nice to keep your naming clean and take some time to make sure that your names and whatnot make sense. Okay, we're going to save this out for future use. I'm just going to replace the one I already made, And that is it for our scene setup. We're ready to pose. All right, so now I'm going to actually start posing out this character. I'm going to use the reference, the reference images that I pulled, take some of those thoughts that we had in our brainstorming planning session and actually start to get this character into our barbarian pose. So generally, I like to start with the big gesture of the pose first. So we'll kind of start by moving around the root, getting like the leg positions, the planting kind of right, and then move upward and outward from there to, working from biggest to smallest. So I'm going to start off showing you some of this posing, but then probably I'll sort of fast forward through some of it and show you the final results afterwards. But let's take a look and start posing out this character. So here was the image that I kind of, liked the most, this kind of hunched forward character. And I think this was pretty representative of a lot of the things that we wanted to get out of this character. So I'm going to start by kind of getting the character low, spreading out the legs, getting that center of mass, over like a really wide platform and get the arms and whatnot out. And then later we'll work on things like the fingers and the face and whatnot. So let's get started. I'm going to turn on my controls here, and I'm going to actually, I don't know how much I'll use this, but I am going to open the picker that they have for this character, make sure that it's working, and it is. And let's start moving this character around. So let's bring these hips down and start getting these feet out into a wider position. And I think that I want, like some of those more action games that we looked at, I think I'm going to want to have the character a little bit more 3/4 towards the camera. I think that just makes the character feel a little bit more dynamic and asymmetrical than if they're just, sort of standing straight forward, looking right, and you're looking right at their back. So getting these feet out really wide, we're going to lean back a little bit, and then I'm going to grab all these spine controls and sort of start getting in a little bit of a hunch forward here. Okay, and I'm just, I'm not too worried about it looking beautiful yet. I'm just trying to get the feel of it. And, I was looking at this image. One of the things that's interesting is the waist is kind of straight up and down, and the hunch doesn't start till up here. So I'm going to try to get this to be sort of straight here, and then feather my hunch a little bit. Oh, that's my hips there, starting here. And then it's a little bit more in the stomach area that the hunch really starts to take over, and then we'll get that there. Okay, I'm going to change these arms to follow world. So I set the follow to 0, and that means now if I move around the rest of the character, they'll start to stay oriented to their world position. So I'm going to change that other one too. There we go. And we're going to start to get these arms down in a position that I like. I'm going to grab these from here because he has a lot of controls on his arms. A lot of times I like to work with the controls completely off on my character and just grab things from my picker. That allows me to be really clean here in my viewport and really see the silhouette of my character. So there's the arms kind of. Now I'm going to look at it from behind because this is kind of going to be the pose I see in game, and I don't really like this tilt I've got going on there. And I'm going to actually have him, as he's kind of leaning forward, he also is sort of straightening out his upper body as well a little bit to camera. So there we're starting to get like a little bit of a nice hunch like I want. I'm going to pull the body down just a little bit to get the knees bent a little bit more. And now I'm going to start working on actually getting, some of these details exactly how I want. Really sort of micro adjusting the arms, taking in the shoulders, bringing them hunching forward a little bit to give them that rounded shape that I think is sort of a key part of the, barbarian feel. And get this arm down. And I think that, I talked about one of the things that I wanted to do is have the weapon feel nice and weighty. So I think it might be good to actually like lean the character a little bit towards the weapon so that it feels like the weight is kind of over the weapon. And let's grab, do I have a control here for the prop? It doesn't look like it, so I'm gonna have to grab my prop control manually, and I'm gonna take this and adjust it into a little bit more of a natural grip position, and I'm gonna start to bring these fingers around it and just start sculpting some of the more micro bits of this pose. I don't care about it being perfect, like a really beautiful grip position yet, because all I'm really caring about is the sort of natural, or the overall gesture of the pose. Now, I really liked in this image the way these hands were sort of like clawed. It added a nice feeling of tension to it. So I'm going to try to do something kind of like that, where I grab the top joints, bend them just a little bit, but really get the tips to be a little bit more like claw-like, and sort of feather these into a little bit more of a natural pose by just grabbing these. And I'll fine tune all this later, but as a starting point, I'm just grabbing things in groups, knowing that I will later pull them out and really fine tune everything on this pose. Okay, so there's a nice like sort of clawed hand. Now I'm gonna work on the feet a little bit to get them a little bit more natural, or maybe bring them in a tiny bit, bring this one in a little bit, and get these heels. Let's see, where's my heel control? Is this it? Yeah, there we go. And rotate that a little bit. You can see that I just like rotate things in world space a lot. I'm not too worried about having clean rotations or anything on my character at this stage in the game. Is that my knee PV? Nope. Let's see, where's my knee pull vector? There it is. Okay. There we go. I want to bring this out a little bit. Choose where I point the knee a little bit more forward. Bring this guy out a little bit. So I'm just kind of really now microing this pose a bit to be more what I want. Now I'm looking back at my reference again. Oops, wrong one. And seeing that maybe even I could pull these out, pull this character out even wider and broader. Okay, so I'm gonna take the arms and bring them out even further, give them a little bit more of a bend, a little bit more of a claw-like feel there. And I'm gonna have this arm be a little bit more bent that's holding the weapon. Just fine-tuning this, getting it to look like a barbarian. Now this neck, while I do like how forward it is, it's a little bit unnatural. I think the character would actually have to be, looking down a little bit to be able to reasonably be in that pose. I might bring the neck up just a little bit here, so that when we see from behind, we see a little sliver of the head over there. Now, when I'm looking at from game view, generally I like everything except for the silhouette I'm getting here. I think I might want to have this weapon actually turned out in silhouette a little bit more, so that from our camera view, we get something, where we see the weapon a little bit more out in profile. So I'm going to work on that section a little bit here, get the weapon kind of out, maybe turn this arm a little bit more like that. Maybe even have the weapon back here like this, more ready to strike might help a lot for my silhouette back here. Yeah, I actually like that a lot, because now this is in our nice ready pose where if I was to do an attack, it's already almost like wound up and ready to strike. So I think at this point, I'm going to stop working on this pose. I might fine tune it a little bit, but it's in a good enough place that I think it's worth now exploring some variants. So I'm going to do that off camera, and then I'll kind of come back and round up once I have a few poses to talk about. All right, so after about 10 minutes of experimenting and just sort of pushing around a few different poses, I ended up with, I think, 5 different poses here that we're going to look through. And I'm going to do a sort of self-critique on these to try to figure out which of these are best hitting our goals and maybe what we can improve about them before we put it in the game. So let's take a look. All right, so here is the pose that I sort of started with. You saw me kind of build this one. This one is still, for me, a strong contender. I think the one thing that if I was to take this pose, I would sort of brush up is to try to get rid of a little bit of the mirroring feeling of it, and also fix up this tangent that's happening right here. But otherwise, it's a pretty good contender, I think. So let's check out the next one. So in this one, I took the same idea. Actually, I just started with that pose and tried crouching it down even more. Now, I like this as a pose. I think it's actually maybe overall a stronger pose than the first one, but it was a little too crouched feeling to be what I would consider the normal default pose for a character. So then I tried to do a more forwardy action pose with the arms back. This one I really liked a lot. But once again, it feels almost too dynamic to be the base idol. Like, it feels like he's about to dash off and smash thing. Like, it's almost like an anticipation for an action as opposed to a more natural resting pose. Then I tried, I was looking back through some of the other reference, and I thought, oh, well, what if I did the Godfall thing where the character is really rotated towards the camera and has the weapon really like right up in your face at the camera. This one, once again, I like quite a bit. I think it's a reasonable contender. It might be a little bit more pushed than I would like for an idle pose, but it has some nice things where the weapon is here, nice and highlighted in the foreground. I think one of the challenging things with a pose like this, where the character really has his side towards the camera, is that your character just has a lot of things overlapping. You know, it's difficult to get all these bits and bobs out in silhouette without getting weird tangents or having shapes that are sitting on top of one another. You know, for example, this upper arm here gets really kind of lost and muddy in the character. So we'll consider this one, but I think I would have to clean it up quite a bit to get it to work. The last pose I have is this one. I thought, well, okay, I did all these ones where he's hunched forward, but I actually had this one piece of artwork, this one, that I had looked at where the character was actually sort of hips forward, body back, the shoulders back, but still had the hunch in the chest. I thought that was a pretty cool pose as well. And I think other than the first one, this is probably my favorite. It feels like a like Mike Mignola pose or something that you'd see in Hellboy, really kind of stylized and pushed. So I'm kind of on the fence between this first one and this last one. I think for my animatory eyes, like, I like this pose better just because it's a little bit more pushed and cool. But I think for game purposes of feeling like a little bit more natural and relaxed and actually reading well from my camera angle, I think that this pose, this kind of initial one that I did, is actually still the winner. You know, sometimes your first idea is the best. Sometimes it's the fifth idea. I often find that I loop back and back and back to early ideas. Sometimes your first gut try at something is often the best. So I'm going to brush up this pose a little bit, and then I'm going to run you through the process of putting it into the game. All right, now that we've settled on a pose, it's time to get this baby in the game. So now I'm going to run you through the process of exporting this animation and putting it onto our character in our third-person project in Unreal. This is going to be our first animation in the game, so buckle up. There's a few steps. It's not too difficult, but follow along and I'll get you there. Here we go. All right, so here I am in Maya. I've kind of cleaned up this scene. It's got just this one pose in it. I'm going to quickly just change my my time slider here to just be 30 frames, and we're going to export this baby out of here. Now, if you did the setup, you're probably kind of familiar already with the exporting process, but this will be a nice little refresher. We're going to go to open the outliner. So we're going to go to Windows, Outliner, and we're going to open up the Thor group and click on Export Group. And we're going to export from there. So that's going to select the mesh and the joints. We don't really need all those other things. And by selecting that, we'll remove a lot of the extra bits that we don't really need to export as part of this. So once we've got that selected, we're going to go to File, Export Selection. And we want it to be an FBX, just like it says. Once again, as I said in the setup, if you don't have the FBX export option there, you might have to go to Windows, Settings, Plugin Manager, and make sure you have FBX export this thing here turned on. Otherwise, it won't show up as an option. So we're going to do that again. File, Export Selection, FBX. We'll hit Export, and you're going to be given a bunch of options. All we need to worry about is that we have animation selected and that we have bake animation selected. And we want to make sure that the frame range is actually the frame range of our timeline here, which in this case it is. So we're going to navigate back to our Thor Anims FBX folder, and we're going to call this Thor Nav Idle F. All right, so that stands for Thor. The prefix is navigation, idle, forward. And this is just because later we might make like lookouts and stuff, so we want to make sure that we have enough descriptors in here. And as I will repeat over and over and over and over and over again, take the time to name your things appropriate so you can keep organized. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess. So let's hit Export Selection. This is going to take a second to run through the whole thing, but it should be pretty quick. We'll see. And while we're waiting for that, I'm going to hop over into the game and do a short refresher here while we're looking in the background. So we want to navigate to our Thor folder. Okay, that just finished in the background. Let's make sure there was nothing. It says complex animations baked. That's fine. No warnings. Good. So hopefully this will come in without a hitch. So over here, we're going to navigate to our Thor character, and we already built this animations folder previously where we put our test animation, and we're going to import this baby. So import, we'll navigate to characters Thor Anims FBX, select our nav idle F, open. And here we have to select the skeleton we want it to be on. So let's search for Thor, boom. And we do not want to import the skeletal mesh. Oops. We don't want to import the mesh. We just want the animation, okay? So this is going to bring in the animation on this skeleton. We'll hit import. Should bring in just the animation file. There we go. And if we open this up, it should be our pose. Now, as we recall from previously, he's on his side, but other than that, it looks good. So let's fix that quick. Remember, we have to add this little offset to each of the animations on this rig. If we look back to this one, it was 90 in X. So let's open up this file, put 90 in X, and hit re-import animation. And all that done, we should have this guy rip-roaring and ready to go. Okay, so there's our idle animation. As I said, it's just a pose. It's not animated yet, but it's enough to get us started. So we're going to go through the process of hooking this up to our character, okay? Now, our character here in the game right now is this mannequin character. We're going to go and actually replace this whole thing with our, let me focus on him, with our Thor character, okay? So let's start doing that. The very first thing we need to do before we do anything else, though, is we need to generate an animation blueprint. Now, what an animation blueprint is it is a piece of code. It's like a blueprint for how the animations on the character are going to operate. And we're going to spend a lot of time there in the future, but we're going to do just a very simple generation of it here. So we're going to go to the skeleton. It's skeleton based. We're going to go to our Thor skeleton file, right click, go up to create, and we're going to create an anim blueprint. And let's call this Thor anim BP. Okay. Now this is going to be a whole new world, and we're not going to go super deep into it at this point, but I'm going to open this up. And just for the sake of simplicity, because we don't want to get too deep on the blueprint now, we're just going to plug our idle animation into this. This is going to be our first animation we're going to hook up in a blueprint, okay? Now you see here that you have two sides to this blueprint. If you look down here on the left side, you have the event graph. This is where we're going to eventually sort of generate our code and our data that's going to drive our animation blueprint. And then over here in the animation graph, we're going to have states and state machines that actually play our animations based off of that data. So all we're going to do for now is right click in here, and we're going to search for our animation by name. So we're going to search idle F, and you see it actually automatically contextually finds it for us. And this is a play animation node, and we're just going to plug that right into here. So what we're saying is, no matter what happens to this character, there's no data, there's no anything, this character is just going to play idle F, and that is it. That's all we want for now. So let's hit compile. You can see that he changed the pose that we brought in here. We'll hit save, and that is it for the animation blueprint for now. So now that we have all the pieces, we have our scale mesh, we have our animation, we have our animation blueprint, we got to actually hook it up and replace this mannequin character that's currently in the game. So we're going to navigate down to the template here into third person blueprints. And in the blueprints folder here, we're going to grab the third person character. Now this is called a pawn, and what this is this is sort of the controller or the character controller that controls the whole character. It has, you can see the inputs, it has the mesh, the camera. It's basically this thing that it's like a container that contains all the bits and bobs that that the character needs to operate. So we're going to replace a couple pieces of this with our pieces that we just generated. Primarily, we're going to be focusing on the mesh. So if you look up here in the top left, there is a module in here called the mesh. We'll click on this. You can see the mannequin skeletal meshes in there, and it doesn't have an animation blueprint right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace this with our character. So let's go ahead and click here, and we'll get our Thor character. And under the animation blueprint, we will get our blueprint. So let's search Thor again, Thor blueprint, and compile and save this. Now, if we look here in the window, look, our mannequin has been replaced with our character and our animation. So let's hit play and see what it looks like. There we are. There's our hulking character. And of course, it doesn't run or jump, but he plays the idle animation, and all the controlling, all the inputs and controls all work because we use the same player controller. We just now have to fill out the animations for the jump and run and whatnot. But overall, this pose reads pretty well. If anything, I think the camera is maybe just a little bit too close, which we can fix later. But, you know, the pose itself reads okay for now. So what we're going to do now is we're going to drop the weapon in there, and then I think we're going to be pretty much wrapped up for now. So let's go back to our third person character here, and we need to go through the same steps to basically bring our mesh for our weapon into the game. Okay, so we're gonna, oh, maybe we are. We're gonna save this scene, and then we're going to open up now our prop. Spite Club, and we're going to basically go through the same exact process. I'm just going to select this, file, export selection, FBX, export. Now, because this is a mesh, not a skeletal mesh, we don't need any of the animation settings, so you can just uncheck that. Let's put this in the right folder, props, FBX, and we'll call this Thor Spiked Club. I'll replace that. I happen to have that in there already. Okay, and now we're good to go. Let's hop back over to Unreal, hop back down here, and in our Thor folder, let's create a new folder corresponding to our one on the art side called props, and we're going to bring that baby right into here. We'll go to import, navigate over to characters, Thor, props, FBX, spiked club, boom. And we can just leave all the settings default. We want to hit import all, so it imports all the materials and everything with it as well. Okay, now if I open this up, it should look just like our thing in Maya did. And look at that, there it be. All right, so the last thing we got to do is connect this to our character. Okay, so we're going to go back and we're going to open up our third-person blueprint, third-person character blueprint again. And we're actually going to add a new module because this character didn't have a weapon attached to it. So we want to add that bit. So we're going to go to add component and we want a static mesh. This mesh didn't have a skeleton, so it's going to be a static mesh. Okay. We can rename this weapon mesh. Okay. And let's grab our mesh. You see when I click here, it opens up all the settings for the mesh, and we want to stub in our club. There it is. Okay. Now, if we go over to the viewport here, you can see that the club is in there and it's just sort of attached to the root. Now, we want to actually parent it to this character and attach it to the hand. Now, if you've ever done any kind of parenting in Maya or even in Photoshop with layers and whatnot, this is very similar. Over here in your component editor, you literally just drag this up under it and it will become a child of it. You can see it nested it right under our mesh. And now you will see over when we select the mesh, it actually has some new options like the parent socket. Okay, so we're going to hook this up. I believe it's called prop right. Okay, and we want to make sure all these offsets up here are zeroed out. Okay, now it looks like we have some issue, and this is game development. Now, why isn't it going into our hand? Prop right is not in the right place. Let's search for prop again. We want IK hand prop right. There we go. That's in the right place. So there we are. We've got our character, weapon in hand, all good to go. Let's compile, save this, close it, and check it out in the game just to make sure everything is as we expect. There we are. There our character is in the game holding their weapon, and they're going to animate beautifully as we go forward. Okay, so that is it for getting into the game. I'm going to do a quick wrap up where we kind of like look at this and assess it and see where we landed. All right, so we got our character all set up in Unreal, and we've got our first animation running on it. We can run around as our character all in idle pose. It's very exciting. But now is the perfect time to take a small step back and take a look at what we've made so far and make sure that it's really nailing it. We want to make sure that this core idle pose is exactly what we want before we move on to other things. So as with all things, it's important whenever you're nearing the end and looking at moving on to the next thing to take a moment and really do like a self-critique of it and try to make another rev on it, okay? So let's take a look at this in game and see if we have any little bits or bobs or little noodly critiques that we can polish up before we move on to runs and whatever comes next. All right, so it's always important to look at the thing in game context and make sure that it is hitting all the things that we want it to hit. Okay, so overall, I'm pretty happy with this pose. It feels very aggressive, feels very actiony. You know, it looks pretty good from the camera. As I noted, I might end up pulling the camera back a little bit if I decide to do that. I'll show you how to do it in the next episode. But let's just for a moment talk about the pose and potentially what we could improve. Okay, so here are my thoughts. Generally, the things that are bugging me about this is this tangent right here kind of stands out very immediately. I think that I might go back into Maya and actually pull this arm out a little bit more, or shift the pose of this weapon a little bit just to get rid of that tangent that's really bugging me. Now, of course, you're going to end up seeing the character from all different directions, so it's unavoidable that there will be some tangents, but just knowing that this is the camera that you'll see most of the time behind the character, you want to try to clean that up as much as you can. Another thing that I don't love is the silhouette that this hand ended up striking. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time on this hand pose when I was doing it, but I think I'll probably go back and take the extra time to get those fingers out into a little bit more of a clawed shape that reads really well from this camera angle. Let's spin the character around a little bit and see what else we can see. I think one more thing from this direction that I might have is that the character does feel a little bit twinned. So I think I could do a little bit of work to rotate the character and get that maybe the upper body feeling a little bit more asymmetrical, where that right arm with the weapon is more back towards camera and the front arm is a little bit more towards like a linebacker-y pose, just to get a little bit of asymmetry into it. On a more noodly perspective, as we sort of dig into the real details, I can probably afford to add an expression to the face now. I think that just sort of blank expression could be improved with a little bit of a, we didn't do any work on the face at all. So that would be a nice little extra step. And lastly, the hand grip pose here just feels like he's sort of meat fisting that club, and I think that we could get a little bit more natural grip on it now that we've sort of decided that we like the pose. So with those notes in mind, I'm not going to show it in this episode, but I'm going to go back and do a rev on this pose, so the next time you see it in the next episode, it'll be all cleaned up with those notes taken into account. And with that, we've wrapped up our idle pose for our character. We covered a lot in this episode, all the way from initial brainstorming to actually seeing it in game and critiquing it. Now is a great time, if you haven't been following along and actually doing this in the episode, to go ahead and actually build your idle pose for your character. It's really important to make sure that this pose really shines, really chef's kiss, right? There's so much that's going to be built on top of this pose down the road that if you're not happy with it now, you're never going to be happy with a lot of your other animations later that transition in and out of this pose. So make sure you take the time to explore a few different poses, follow through, get them into game, and try to find the one that you like the most. And really, really be hard on this animation, because you want to make sure that it really shines. I really recommend too that, if you're not particularly good at doing self-critiques, that you reach out and try to get some feedback from other animators. Oftentimes there's things that we miss. I miss things all the time. It's very hard to critique your own work. So make sure that you get another set of eyes on your work and that you're looking at it in game context. So that's it for this episode. I hope you'll join me next time. But until then, happy animating.